This is Retrohammer, Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader Rulebook from 1987. It is easy to overstate the significance and ascribe more impact to products than was ever true, but in the case of the first edition of the Warhammer 40,000 Rulebook, there is no risk of this happening. Without a shadow of a doubt, this rulebook was the origin of the massive success of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, and indeed Games Workshop itself, and without this brainchild of Rick Priestley, would probably have never become the global business we know today. This book was groundbreaking on many levels. It was an early example of a skirmish wargame, with one model representing one combatant, as opposed to larger scale formations that traditionally dominated tabletop wargaming. It created a complex, diverse and believable universe that was original in itself yet familiar, as it blended themes from history and other science fiction together into a seamless whole. It was artistically striking, rich and somewhat eclectic, yet had just enough of an underlying dark theme to gel together as one in the reader's imagination. Games Workshop was able to make a great variety of models in sufficient quantities to meet the mass market demand. It was also backed up by a large group of individuals who seemed to have come together at the right moment in time in history with the right mix of skills to make a game that has stood the test of time and, for at least 2 decades, dominated the market. 30 years later, Warhammer 40,000 has evolved and changed, it now being in its 7th edition, and yet it remains somewhat familiar to the original game. Perhaps even more significant is the unstoppable growth of the lore behind this dissonant, frightening universe, which has grown to become something that is possibly unique in its depth, diversity and scope. However, one meme links this game of today to this first rulebook published 3 decades ago, an idea that is as clear and unchanged now as it was then, even giving rise to a word of its own. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And welcome to Retrohammer, episode 5. And this one is going to be a book review of none other than the original Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader Rulebook from 1987, and the principal author, as we see down at the bottom here, was Rick Priestley. Yeah, I'm going to do this in the following way. I'm going to talk a little bit about my early memories of this book, and obviously a very significant book from the point of view of the game. And then I'm going to go through this as a cover-to-cover review and talk a bit about the game and the art and the writing within this book, and yeah, just look back on what this was like as a game. So I first remember seeing this, and my first ever sight of Warhammer 40,000 looked something like this. It was the spine of the book, and it was on a bookshelf in a then model store called Beatty's, which was active in the United Kingdom. I don't know if it had any other. I don't know if it had any other international operations, but yeah, it was a general model store. It was a big model store, a really big chain, and yeah, and I was in Leeds one day. I was quite young. I think I was probably maybe 13, and I saw this, and it caught my eye, and I pulled it out and I looked at the cover, and it certainly caught my eye. I'd never seen anything quite like this before. I remember it was sealed at the time, so I couldn't actually read it, and it was disturbing and compelling at the same time. And I didn't buy it then, so I think I was with my parents. I don't know what they'd have thought if I'd asked to buy it, but yeah, it was not long after that friends got hold of copies, and we started. But yeah, well, this is the book that started what became was the genesis of Games Workshop's greatest success, and without this, they would arguably, well, I don't think arguably, they would never have achieved the success that they achieved, that they have had, and reached the size they are today. So yeah, let's go through this most iconic of rule books. And obviously the first thing that grabs you about it is the artwork on the front by John Civic of the Crimson Fist's desperate last stand against the Orcs. And centre stage, interestingly, is not perhaps the Crimson Fists themselves, but this decapitated head of an Orc warrior being held by this this leader of the Crimson Fists. But yes, a brilliant piece of art, that. And if we just flip to the back before we get into this, there is no time for peace, no respite, no forgiveness, there is only war. And indeed, the artwork certainly set the stage for that. And yes, here we have another gritty depiction of 41st Millennium combat. And one of the common themes with 40k artwork is the closeness of the combat that's depicted. It's very up close and brutal, and this picture was no exception. And one thing that the artists of the time did very well is they blended actual miniatures and they drew them into scenes exactly as they appeared. And we can see this with a number of Space Marines here. This is the master of the signal officer, a medic, another troop of missile launcher troops, and then the sergeant here. I mean, I can remember all these miniatures. And then of course we have one of the original Dreadnought suit armor designs. That was a model by Bob Naismith. But yeah, I won't read this here, but that's the famous scene setting couple of paragraphs which sort of pull you into the universe. And it was a very interesting and unusual universe, because while this is a science fiction game, it's also set in a highly superstitious and alien universe to what we know today. So the book was split into a number of sections. There was combat, which is the rules, a scenario, battle at the farm, equipment, which details of war gear, and straight from the get-go there was a lot of war gear in this. And then a large section of the book and was actually about the history and the background to the Warhammer 40,000 universe. And this is really, I suppose, what set this apart, because the rules was only 50 pages long, yet the background was well, you know, I don't know, maybe 78 pages long. Actually no, nearer 100 pages long. So straight away there's an interesting scene setting here, or an interesting proportion of attention here between the rules, which are fairly short and straightforward, but the background gets an enormous amount of attention. And that's what makes this made this such a rich and interesting game at the time. There was then a section on the advanced gamer, which interestingly has which has some extra rules, but most of it is actually about terrain and painting. And there's actually quite a large section on that in this book, which is interesting in itself, and it makes it a very complete product. So you have the rules, you have the history, you have the scenario, you have advanced rules, but then you have a large section on modelling, and then you have summary sheets as well. So it was a very complete product at the time, and clearly there must have been some careful design and writing that led to that. Another obviously important thing about this is there was a large group of creative team that went behind Warhammer 40,000, and while obviously Rick Priestley was the principal author, there were a whole host of people who contributed to make it happen, and it wouldn't have been the product it is without all those people. So it starts off with a brief introduction to the concept of the game and perhaps what a war game is, or in this case a skirmish war game in interest. And Rick Priestley describes this as a fantasy game from the start, which is interesting. And talks about dice, and then it's straight into the combat section, where it talks to you about how to set up a battlefield and scenery, which is just a little bit of a kind of scene setter, I suppose, if you've never played a game like this before. And then it gets straight into the rules. Now, first thing it talks about is troop characteristics. These would be familiar to a player today of the 7th edition. These are largely unchanged, apart from the personal characteristics have been significantly simplified. So instead of having leadership, intelligence, cool, and willpower, all of this has been distilled down into just a leadership characteristic, which is part of the nature of how the game changed over the years. The basic human profile, exactly as it is today, unchanged. So there are a lot of things that Rick Priestley got right in this book that remain constant over 30 years of game development. Lots of this dark artwork, as we'll come to as we go along, and straight away, you know, lots of miniatures to create to sort of paint the picture of the game in your mind, and talks about the models that you can get. And then it moves into the actual the game rules, and straight away this deals with movement. I mean, one thing in the original 40k is movement was slower. You would move at 4 inches would be a walk in effect, or a standard move, and then you could move a further 4 inches under certain conditions as a reserve move, for a total maximum move of 8 inches for a human in a game. This in the modern 40k is actually 12 inches. However, lots of troops had variable move rates, and then you also had to deal with encumbrance. So, but it was perhaps a slower distance covering game. However, the range combat was more potent, or certainly had a stronger effect, I think, than the modern 40k. Well, balance it. Yeah, so goes through all the basic rules. Throughout this book, there's lots of art is interspersed with the rules, so it never gets too heavy going. It's nicely laid out and it reads well. Interesting thing on the game style here, this is a whole range of shooting to hit modifiers. So in the current 40k, most shooting is just taken at your ballistic skill. There's very few things that affect your chance of hitting. This in the original 40k, however, that wasn't the case. So lots of modifiers you'd apply to ballistic skill, and indeed cover would reduce the chance of hitting as opposed to giving a saving throw. This is a well-known concept, the strength versus toughness chart. This is unchanged. It's exactly the same now as it was then. It talks about the concepts of wounding, saving throws, weapon area effect deviation, all the normal rules. Not all the rules in this were conceptually good, although a lot of them were really good. This is a slightly obtuse rule, which was around area effect weapons, and the chance of deviating was governed by the template size of a weapon. So the bigger your template effect, the less accurate it became. It may have been put in as a balancing effect, but it was a bit of a bit odd, shall we say, and something that was actually ditched quite early on, or shall we say adapted. And it covers close combat, close combat to hit rolls. This is different to the modern table. This is kind of like shifted 1 point adverse. So in the current 40k, opponents of equal close combat ability strike each other on a 4. In the original 40k, it was actually on a 5. So close combat was slower as a result, certainly between. However, you could get bigger variations in close combat ability as well. Another one of these dark style pictures. Interestingly, this is actually one of the first long-serving characters described in this book, and this is actually a picture of Leman Russ, who's described as being instrumental in founding Adeptus Astartes Unit 4, the Space Wolves. It describes how his lungs were burnt out on a planet. Obviously, at this point, the concept of a Primarch didn't exist, but this original character was drawn through and becomes a modern day Primarch. And then it goes through the rules. Hand-to-hand combat was very different. There's no concept like overrunning. You couldn't overrun opponents. You would push opponents back, and they could run away, but you couldn't. And if they ran away, you could strike a free hack or a swipe at them as they ran away, but you couldn't just run them down and wipe them out. There's nothing like that at all. And even at this stage, there's actually a lot of rules governing close combat. which I suppose set the scene for this slightly unusual focus on close combat in a futuristic game. Yeah, and then you got reserves, because you didn't run, then you would do a reserve move. A section on psychology, so around tests around those personal characteristics that later disappeared. Overview of buildings. It had a full set of rules for vehicles. The only vehicle we would recognise today, well, there's only a couple. There were a few actually, but I mean the most recognisable vehicle that was described in this rule book was the Land Raider. Dreadnought suits. Back then dreadnoughts had wounds. They had a damage table. Vehicles has been one of the most experimented with part of the rules of in 40k, and there's been all sorts of weird and wonderful approaches over the years, and it's ironic now that we've come full circle with the hull point and damage table system to something actually not a million miles away from the original concept. And robots, and there's also rules for flyers, full set of rules for flyers there. Discussion around how to generate personalities. I mean, there's often debate as to whether or not 40k was a role-playing game or a war game, or both. I suppose it was both. It was almost all things to all men, to use a phrase. I never played it as a role-playing game. No, me and my gaming group, we just played it as a war game from the get-go. But the functionality was there if you wanted to do that. And psionics, and here we have the original, these are all the original psionic abilities. Players from a time will, I'm sure, remember well wanting to have the level 4 power of temporal distort, which allowed you to repeat parts of your turn. That was I'm sure that was used and abused a lot. And then there's a section on mutants as well, which is quite intriguing and actually detailed and well developed for the time. And there's a whole set of mutations and their effects on people, and some danger mutants, humorous pictures. And quite a lot of 40k had a certain tongue-in-cheek, whimsical nature to it, which was lost a lot in later editions, although perhaps we're seeing a little bit of a return of that. And if you look on the Warhammer community and the regimental standard bulletin, that's perhaps recapturing some of this early tongue-in-cheek nature and humour of the game. This section on mutants was a precursor to what came in a later book, The Realm of Chaos Slaves to Darkness, which introduced a extremely detailed and comprehensive system called the Chaos Attribute System, and you can see the origins of Chaos Attributes in these mutants. And then points values. The game came with a full set, a comprehensive point scheme, so straight away you could create units and balance them against one another. I mean, a lot of the narrative in this game is around using a GM to balance a game, and saying how you should aim for a narrative approach to achieve balance. But as I said, yeah, we never used a GM. We just wargamed it. Interestingly, points values haven't probably moved a million miles from here now. Just for interest, I worked out what 10 Space Marines with bolt guns would cost, and under this I think they're about 190 points, which probably isn't a million miles away from what they cost now. Although vehicle costs have changed dramatically, because under this scheme a Land Raider cost hundreds and hundreds of points. I think it was about 750 or something. And that concludes the rules section in effect, and it just finishes off with this battle at the farm, which was a tale of the Crimson Fists trying to reach the disaster on Rinworlds on Rindsworld, if I remember rightly, with the invasion of the Orc warlords Snagrod, and the accident with their missiles and the almost annihilation of their chapter. And this was developed into an entire novel in later years called Rindsworld, and it features none other than a Captain Pedro Cantor, which is actually based on a member of the team, his name. Of course, he became Chapter Master Pedro Cantor. Right, equipment. So Big section on equipment, which was one of the great things about this. It was a sci-fi game, and Rick Priestley let his mind run riot with futuristic guns, which is great. One thing about this is he talks about the ranges and saying they may seem small, but it's a reflection of a style of warfare. However, he did give straight away gave optional rules that if you wanted to shoot further, you could. So there's rules here to allow you to shoot 10 times the maximum range of a weapon straight away. So, you know, bolt gun can fire up to 240 inches away, which opened up some interesting possibilities. And me and my friends, I can remember taking over our gardens and actually doing some extremely long range games, which was a novel. And here we go with the guns. Lots and lots of guns, and one of our perennial favourites, a bolt gun. And it's interesting to have the futuristic bolter alongside the primitive bow. This is a reprint, this copy. This copy of Warhammer 40,000. It had been on. This has been on my Retrohammer to-do list for a bit. However, with a surprise re-release of the Warhammer 40,000 rulebook, which this is a copy I picked up, I thought, well, let's get it done. It has this is the original impression, and it has all the typos and typesetting errors still in it. So here it has bolt gun with the bow profile and bow with the bolt gun profile, and there's lots of that as we move through it. Again, really great artwork all the way through. Needle guns, melt guns, picture by Alan Morrison there. And so all the way through, you've got this fantastic juxtapositioning of the super futuristic, the plasma gun, alongside a sling and an antique pistol. But they were all included, so straight away you were given a tremendous variety of ideas for creating games. Web guns, not sure if we have those in 40k anymore. And a power glove, not a power fist, no, a power glove. You've got to keep your hands warm in combat. And then you go from basic weapons to close combat weapons, then on to heavy weapons. And most of the heavy weapons haven't changed that much. I mean, you have distortion cannons, you have conversion beamers, and auto cannons, so very familiar to the 40k player. Have the heavy plasma gun, heavy bolt gun. There are some on the, I don't know who did these drawings, but there are some interesting what appear to be typos up. I don't know if they're deliberate or not, because there's a little bit here, it says honour your chapter, but the spelling of honour is H-O-N-O-R, so it's the American English spelling. Of course, this was written in England, in Britain, which I wouldn't have expected to see that. So I don't know if these were done by, if it was a deliberate spelling error, or if an American artist did these. Then you had a good few heavy weapons. I mean, the multi-mouse was a formidable weapon even back then. And then it moved to very heavy weapons, which are a bit kind of like a bit like super heavy weapons, or D weapons of the modern game. And certainly they had the similar killing power and size. And another interesting spelling error there. Exist for the Emperor. Emperor spelled E-M-P-O-R-E-R. So, yeah, still got the original typesetting errors. And then you had grenades and missiles. There was a wide variety of the weird and wonderful in here. Hallucinogen gas, that was hilarious. When the first time we played with hallucinogen gas, we didn't put two and two together and realise that Marines were immune to it. And we were having our Marines go throwing hallucinogen grenades at each other, and having Marines tripping out on all sorts of hallucinations. And the vortex grenade, it's an early appearance in the game. Interesting, although this was kind of like a skirmish game, it did include support weapons as well. And when we say support weapons, these are like large scale, heavy off-table support weapons. So from early on, you had some very heavy firepower available to use in your games. Then we had vehicle profiles. So there's a good section on vehicles. Seeing this here, an early prototype Tyranid model. Lots of great artwork in this. With this reprint, it's a bit odd. Some of the black saturation is a bit high. And you can see on this picture, for example, that some of the original artwork comes through very dark, and I'm not sure why that is, because a lot of it looks fine. It might be because in the original book this was all printed on matte paper, whereas this is a glossy paper. But there's loads of ideas for vehicles, and it certainly gave you lots. And here we have the original Land Raider. This was a prototype model. This one was never released, and it was made, I believe, was it a guy called Dave Andrews? Let me have a quick check at the front. Yeah, Dave Andrews. Yeah, and you can see that the actual Land Raider ended up looking, not a million miles away from that. But I don't know what happened to this. Yeah, never seen it in the flesh, so to speak. More of this gritty, grim artwork, and certainly was something that was quite disturbing. A well-known picture, exploded diagram of the Mark 6 suit of powered armour for the Space Marines. This is armour, so you got loads and loads of detail on equipment, robots. This was an early picture of a war robot, and there's lots of little annotations, and they're all written in the arcane, weird and wonderful way that 40k technology goes, whereby you would strike runes to make things work as opposed to operating a control panel. Bionics, special equipment, the porter rack, quite grisly, power fields, all sorts, lots and lots of equipment. All the weird and wonderful art. And they were really experimenting with the artistic styles at the time. They really threw stuff together and just to see how it all gelled together. But as I said at the start, it was eclectic, but yet there was enough of the theme to make it plausible, to make it feel like it was part of a single project. This is a well-known picture. It's by I think it's by Ian Miller. Thousands of Marines lined up on parade, and this brings us to the start of the section called the Age of the Imperium. And here we move from the rules into the lore, and this is what really brought the game to life. And here we have we had a detailed description of what the warp was, what the Imperium was, what humans were, psychers and their vulnerabilities, the different parts of the Imperium, so the Adeptus Custodes, Adeptus Mechanicus, the Arbites, the Astronomicon, and so on and so forth. The Inquisition was mentioned. It talks about types of planets in the Imperium, and then it gets on to a section where it talks about the Emperor. Now at this point there was no mention of the Horus Heresy, that was something that was to come later, but at this point the Emperor was described as being an immobile carcass on the Golden Throne, sending out the psychic signal of the Astronomicon to guide humanity through the stars. And yes, here we had a rather grisly depiction of what the Emperor might look like in the 41st millennium. And it's not the only one, there's a couple of these, which straight away adds to the mystery of the whole thing. More weird and wonderful, well, weird and disturbing denizens of the 41st millennium. Certainly part of the Adeptus Mechanicus, looking far from human now. The Inquisition and the Inquisitors, a nice straightforward hierarchy: Emperor, Master of the Inquisition, Inquisition agents. There you go, no messing around there, is there? Psychers. Obviously Psychers play a big part in the 40k universe. They're described in detail, and astropaths and navigators are also described. And then of course we get to, well, the thing that really grabbed most people's attention early on, which was the Legions Astartes, the Space Marines. Yeah, and here we go. Yeah, many of the captions, "and they shall know no fear," were coined very early on, and have remained unchanged since. So The modern 40k remains faithful to the original book in many ways. Original selection of chapters, most of which became legions, but not all. There's a cutaway drawing of the fortress monastery of the Space Wolves on the planet Lucan, and the Space Wolves were humorously led by Lord Lucan at the time. Obviously I think a reference to a real life person, although not so humorous now perhaps. And then we move on to the Imperial Army. Another quite different art style. This is like 70s sci-fi art, 70s early 80s sci-fi art. The Rogue Trader. So the guys that gave the name to this game, the Rogue Traders, get a detailed section, although relatively minor against the rest of it. I mean, arguably the game would have been better named Warhammer 40,000 Space Marines, but no. And here we go, the artistic depiction of the first 12 Marine chapters. Rainbow Warriors, bless them. I'd love to know if that was mocking Greenpeace or in solidarity to Greenpeace by calling a chapter of Marines violent, bloodthirsty warriors, Rainbow Warriors. It could be either way. The Assassins. So yeah, as we can see, many of the denizens and characters of the game we know now were established straight away in this original rulebook. Here we have the second detailed artistic depiction of the Emperor, surrounded by the Custodes, and here we have a sad, perhaps a sad queue of members of the Adeptus Astronomica making their way to the Golden Throne to sacrifice themselves to the Emperor. Marines in a bar. And yeah, that was a bit, I suppose, yeah, a bit more of the whimsical nature of this early game. It wasn't quite so serious. Well, it was serious, but it had its tongue in its cheek at times. So in this picture here, I'm going to show you this one up close. Here we have some perhaps not so noble ultramarines. And it says the spoils of war, slaves. So here we go, some ultramarines who've taken some squats as slave prisoners. Not looking quite so noble there, those ultramarines. And then the Eldar. The Eldar were very potent in this original game, very powerful fighters. Another one of these wonderful dioramas. And those run, and again, that's part of the visual richness of this book. All the way through, you've got a mixture of the art combined with the pictures of the miniatures, combined with scenes created with the miniatures and terrain. And then we move into the orcs. Slightly whimsical art again. This is more like in the style of perhaps Talisman Timescape or Talisman in general. Gretchen. This is a well-known picture, and one that had a significant impact on the later game. So this is the well-known Pontifex Maximus depiction of an Adeptus Mechanicus text priest, of course painted by none other than John Blanche. And certainly John Blanche was someone who had an enormous impact on the visuals of the 40k universe. Not all races survive though. The Slan are a non-entity like the squats in the modern 40k game. The Jacaro, this is if you were to look at a section of the 40k rulebook as being tongue-in-cheek and whimsical, surely the Jacaro personify that. The Jacaro they look like orangutans, but they have an amazing propensity for technological aptitude, and basically it was really silly. You could kind of like give them a pile of weapons and they'll turn it into a tank, or give them a crate of lasguns and they'll make it into a las cannon. It was great fun. And even there it says intelligence ? Nobody really knows. I wonder with the Jacaro if I don't know this, and I'll be interested to check. I'll have to do this. I don't know if the Jacaro are loosely based around the character of the librarian from the Terry Pratchett Discworld novels. I don't know which came first. They certainly seem to be not entirely unlike the librarian. I'll stick that in the comments later once I find it out. There's a cool picture of some Space Wolves and Silver Skulls raising a flag, and this is actually a re-image of a real photo, a famous photo of US Marines raising the flag over Iwo Jima, which was taken by Joe Rosenthal in 1945 at the end of the bloody battle. So an interesting re-imaging of a very famous photo from history. And the Tyranids. Here's a Proto-Tyranid. I love the Proto-Tyranid. I wish they'll do some new models. I much preferred them in their original thing. They've got a little bit cartoony these days, I think. Although the nature of the Tyranids is very much defined here, and it said the Tyranid threat to the universe is impossible to measure, but is potentially very great indeed. Their whole attitude to other races can only result in war whenever they are met, a war which only the Tyranids can win. So even in this original 40k rulebook, the die was cast for what the Tyranids were going to be like. Zotes are gone, but Zotes were great. They were a slave warrior race of the Tyranids. However, when freed of their control, they became powerful, independent beings in their own right. And then we move into a section of warp creatures. So this truly is a selection of the weird and wonderful. These guys are great, the Enslavers. You could create some great scenarios around those guys. And we also get a look at what are called warp entities here, which essentially are demons. Although it portrays them in a slightly more sympathetic way here, where it basically says if they get pulled through into the material universe by psychers, they don't want to be there and hence are very angry, and all they're interested in is trying to escape back into the warp. That kind of got reversed somewhat later on, and they seem to it go the other way. Personal favourite of mine here, the Amble. I'll be doing a separate Retrohammer on that later, but the Amble is the first creature at the start of the large section on alien beasties, and one of it was quite a nice whimsical part of the game that you had all these alien creatures you could use in scenarios to challenge the players. Here's a personal favourite, the Catachan Face Eater. So, and here we can see it now. If you think that looks like a flannel, you're correct. And the Face Eater is described as liking moist environments, moist, warm environments, and it looks like a flannel. And it goes to say though that, and its mode of attack was to dissolve the face of its victims and lay eggs in their faces. So yes, something that looks like a flannel, hides in the bathroom. You know what happens next. The Gene Stealer from the moon of Yugumal, if I can say it right. At this point, they weren't linked to the Tyranids. That came later. But all sorts of weird and wonderful, so giant insects, giant spiders, intelligent cats, horses, killer squirrels, rippy fish, and then you get on. Then if the armory of deadly animals wasn't enough, then we've got the same in the animal section. So the Venus mantrap, yes, you got it right. There was also humorous stuff as well, like rubber moths, and you could have a field of rubber moths, and if you entered it, you guys just bounced around. And I remember doing games where squads of Marines just bounced all over the place after trying to cross rubber moths. It was fun. And there's randomizing charts for creating stuff. This section is I believe this is sort of depicting a border world. I think this is supposed to be Logan's World, if I remember rightly. Yeah, Logan's World. Very different artistic style. Reminds you of this is by the guy Plod who did Thrud the Barbarian, I believe. Wonder if we might get done for copyright infringement there. Those legs have been taken from a Macross destroyed robot. And then we have the advanced gamer section. So gave you some additional rules which are quite neat to expand things out. It's quite easy to apply really. But all this, I mean, it was just the scope of rules was really good, and there's either a plot generator for doing campaigns, and it really was a very well thought out and comprehensive set of rules. There's a cover art in its almost in its full form. So upon buying this, you really, you weren't stuck for ideas. And then this section, you get a section where it talks about collecting, painting, modelling in quite great detail, and it's almost like you could take this and make it into a book of its own about modelling and stuff. There's a good picture here, one of the slightly grittier style pictures you don't get so much these days, of a marine boarding party entering an orc ship and well, meeting stiff resistance, and I don't know what he got shot with, but yeah, looks like he's been reduced to a bit of a puddle. And it even talks about the hoarding impulse, so he really had got everything covered. So we all know about that, don't we? Caption competition for anyone who can name all these guys. These are kind of like all caricatures of the various people at Games Workshop who are involved in the production. I mean, there's a few obvious ones that I can spot. I mean, that's Rick Priestley, Jervis Johnson, that I think is John Blanche. That might be the Perry twins, I'm not sure. I'd like to know who this guy is with the girls, hormones. It says, I'd be intrigued to know who that was. Ali and Trish Morrison, maybe? Yeah, funny that. I like that. Quite an interesting bunch of people who made this. And then the final section is a summary of the rules, and this pulls all the key bits together in a nice little area, which was useful for reference. It also then goes to talk about the language of the Imperium here, and then also technology. And this is something that kind of like disappeared from later, or certainly disappeared out of the lore later on, where it actually talked about quite detailed information about how the technology worked in the Imperium, which is really quite interesting and probably still relevant today. This little story, or this little picture here with Sister Sin taking out one of the Rainbow Warriors, Brother Vermilion, talks about the Adeptus Sororitas. So another part of the 40k lore that draws its histories back to this very book. And then more on technology and the like, and it finishes up by talking about what became a central meme in the 40k storyline, the standard template construct, and more of this weird and wonderful artwork. And then a timeline as well, which more or less speaking is familiar to now. Yeah, this timeline has been fleshed out but has remained largely unchanged. And then you've got a set of play sheets at the back that you could cut out to use, a set of counters to play the battle at the farm, and briefs. Let's just see on the rear packaging, and a little bit of miniature advertising, which Games Workshop was always very good at with its products. And there you have it. Warhammer. There you have the book, Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader. The book that started it all. Yeah, the one that started it all. I think it's interesting that this has just been reprinted, 30 years on from the original publication date. I wonder if we're going to see more sort of, shall I say, nostalgia products. And it's interesting for Games Workshop to republish a set of rules that are much superseded now. I know it certainly rekindled my interest in it, and a few of my friends, and we're going to go back and game do some gaming back with the original 40k rules as well. But this whole thing was, this rulebook came out, but there was a whole set of easily accessible supporting rules at the time, which featured in White Dwarf. So starting around White Dwarf, probably the early 90s, running onwards, there was all the things like the Marine Armour List, the Harlequin Armour List, Guardsman Armour List, Dreadnoughts. So by the scope of this got expanded very quickly, and it certainly got steered down the wargame route quite quickly with the introduction of the armour lists. And the follow-on book to this, which was Warhammer 40,000 Compendium, was equally as significant in terms of the game, and certainly probably the book that a lot of people cut their teeth on with the actual wargaming side of this. But yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this. Been quite a long review, but well, it's an iconic product, and I can say it's an iconic product. Perhaps it's not actually an iconic product. Perhaps it should be described as a seminal product in terms of the long and far-reaching influence it's had. Thank you very much for listening. That was Retrohammer. Goodbye.